On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy, the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history, a company that once produced half of all cars sold in America. A company so powerful that its president told Congress, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." That company was now begging the government for survival. The U.S. Treasury would inject $49.5 billion in taxpayer money. 21,000 workers would lose their jobs. 2,000 dealerships would close overnight. The final cost to American taxpayers, $11.2 billion that would never be recovered. This is the story of how the most powerful corporation in the world spent 50 years ignoring every warning, crushing competitors through politics instead of innovation, and ultimately forcing the American public to pay for its arrogance. By 1955, General Motors became the first corporation in history to earn $1 billion in a single year. They controlled 54% of the American car market. More than 1 out of every 2 cars sold was a GM vehicle. The Justice Department considered breaking them up under antitrust laws. GM employed 618,365 workers across 150 plants in 35 countries, the largest private employer in the world. Their health insurance covered so many families that it shaped national healthcare expectations. Their wages set the standard for the American middle class. General Motors didn't just make cars, it made modern America. But dominance created a culture that would destroy everything. With 54% market share and no competition, GM stopped asking what customers wanted. They told customers what they would get. The philosophy was simple: change the styling every year, keep the engineering the same, let marketing handle the rest. Planned obsolescence. Make this year's model look outdated so customers buy next year's. Then competition arrived. In 1968, Toyota launched the Corolla in America. Small, fuel-efficient, reliable, cheap. GM executives laughed. Japanese cars were toys, no threat whatsoever. October 1973 changed everything. Arab oil producers announced an embargo. Gas prices quadrupled overnight. Lines at stations stretched for blocks. The average GM car got 12 miles per gallon. The Toyota Corolla got 30. Americans who'd never considered foreign cars started walking into Toyota dealerships. They came for fuel economy. They stayed because the cars didn't break down. GM's response: denial. Rather than admit Japanese manufacturers had superior engineering, they lobbied Congress for import restrictions. Rather than improve quality, they blamed American workers. Rather than build smaller cars, they assumed oil prices would fall and buyers would return. By 1980, Japan had overtaken America as the world's largest automobile producer. GM's market share dropped from 54% to 44%. They lost money for the first time since 1921. The crisis demanded radical change. What GM did instead would cost them everything. In 1981, CEO Roger Smith announced the most ambitious modernization in industrial history. $90 billion over 10 years to automate every factory. Robots would replace workers. Computers would replace managers. Smith believed technology could solve every problem, including the problem he refused to acknowledge. GM's cars weren't as good as Toyota's. The numbers were brutal. GM needed 40 hours to produce 1 car. Toyota needed 18. GM averaged 1.5 defects per vehicle. Toyota averaged 0.5. Smith didn't visit Toyota to learn their methods. He wanted a technological leap that would make Japanese manufacturing obsolete. So he bought robots, thousands of them. The result was catastrophe. At GM's Hamtramck plant, robots painted each other instead of cars. Robots welded doors shut with workers inside. The factory shut down repeatedly while engineers figured out what went wrong. Workers joked that Hamtramck stood for "Had a manufacturer try robot and caught K-Rap." The $90 billion produced almost nothing. Researchers found GM improved less than it would have by simply copying Toyota's existing methods. GM spent nearly $100 billion trying to avoid learning from a competitor they refused to take seriously. Meanwhile, Roger Smith collected $2 million per year, while closing 11 plants and eliminating 74,000 jobs. In 1991, GM discovered a loophole. SUVs weren't subject to car fuel economy standards. They weren't subject to car safety standards, and buyers could write them off on taxes. A Chevy Suburban sold for $40,000 with $15,000 in profit. A Chevy Cavalier sold for $15,000 with $1,500 in profit. The math was irresistible. GM pivoted everything toward SUVs: Tahoe, Yukon, Escalade, Hummer. For a decade, it worked. SUV profits covered pension obligations. They funded healthcare for 1.1 million retirees. They masked fundamental problems getting worse every year. Market share kept falling, from 44% to 35% to 28%. But profits stayed high because each SUV generated so much cash. Executives convinced themselves they'd solved everything. America wanted trucks. GM made the best trucks. Let Toyota have the sedans. By 2000, the Toyota Camry was America's best-selling car. Honda Accord was second. GM didn't have a single vehicle in the top three. Nobody worried. Sedans were low margin anyway. Then gas prices started climbing again. By 2005, GM's healthcare obligations added $1,500 to every vehicle. Toyota had almost zero retiree costs. That $1,500 went straight into their product. GM's pension fund was underfunded by $31 billion. They'd promised retirement security they never saved for. Consumer Reports rated GM among the least reliable brands. Toyota and Honda dominated the top. Internal documents showed executives knew exactly how bad things were. They chose not to act, because fixing problems required confrontation with unions, dealers, and their own habits. It was easier to wait. On August 1st, 2008, GM reported a $15.5 billion quarterly loss, the worst in company history. 6 weeks later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Car sales vanished. GM burned $2 billion monthly. On November 18, 2008, GM's CEO flew to Washington on a private jet to beg Congress for a bailout. The image destroyed any sympathy. A failing company's executive begging for taxpayer money while traveling in a $20,000 per hour aircraft. Congressman Gary Ackerman said it plainly. Couldn't you have downgraded to first class? It's like showing up at the soup kitchen in a top hat. June 1st, 2009, bankruptcy. The government took 60.8% ownership. Pontiac, killed. Saturn, killed. Hummer, killed. 4 of 8 brands gone overnight. 2,000 dealerships terminated with weeks of notice. Owners who'd invested their entire lives received nothing. Towns that depended on GM for generations faced collapse. Flint, Michigan, GM's birthplace, had already lost 80% of its GM workforce. The restructured company emerged in 40 days. Total taxpayer loss, $11.2 billion. But the story doesn't end there. On February 13, 2014, GM recalled 619,122 vehicles for defective ignition switches. The switch could suddenly turn off while driving, killing power steering, power brakes, and airbags at highway speed. Internal documents revealed GM engineers knew about the defect since 2004, a decade earlier. The fix would have cost less than $1 per vehicle. Management chose production schedules over safety. Over 10 years, GM received hundreds of crash reports, airbags that didn't deploy, drivers who lost control. At least 124 people died. GM's response to early reports: blame the customers. Heavy keychains were causing problems. Don't hang so much stuff from your keys. Nobody went to prison. Executives who made the decisions retired with bonuses intact. GM paid $900 million in fines. Their profit that year, $2.8 billion. General Motors didn't fail because of one bad decision. It failed because a company that dominated the world convinced itself dominance was permanent. 3 mistakes destroyed them. First, they treated competition as a political problem instead of an engineering problem. When Toyota made better cars, GM lobbied Congress instead of improving products. Second, they let financial engineering replace actual engineering. SUV profits masked problems until there was nothing left to mask. Third, they convinced themselves customers had no choice. By the time they learned otherwise, it was too late. The phrase, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country," defined an era. The 2009 bailout proved it worked both ways. When GM failed, America paid. $11.2 billion in losses. 124 deaths from defects they knew about. Towns devastated. A century of leadership surrendered. The executives retired wealthy. The workers lost jobs. The customers lost lives. Somewhere in Detroit, there's a conference room where executives are making decisions about the next decade. The warning signs are always visible. The data is always available. General Motors looked away for 50 years. The next company that makes the same mistake will pay the same price. The only question is who gets the bill.